Morning church, Matt Carvel here. Hope you are doing well. It's the 14th of September and we are beginning Paul's letter to the Galatians. We're in chapter 1. Unlike most of the others of Paul's letters in the New Testament, Galatians doesn't open with a very warm greeting and a celebration of the gospel and all that Jesus has done. That's the usual pattern. Actually, what we see is Paul seems to jump straight in with how he's feeling and what he wants to address with them. And verse 6 sets the tone for that. I am astonished, Paul says. This letter that he is writing is clearly not a sort of postcard by the beach kind of affair. No, it's a direct, immediate response, most likely, to news that he's heard about the Galatian church and what was going on there, what they were talking about and what was being taught in that church. And Paul is immediately and urgently responding. So the immediate question is, well, what have they done? What needs addressing so urgently? What mess has this church got themselves into? Well, it's important to think about as well that take Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Now, in those letters, there are huge amounts of problems that the Corinthians had that are very serious. You know, there was infighting, there was church members suing one another, there was sexual immorality, they were not getting worship right, they were not getting the Lord's Supper right, and all those things Paul addresses in the letters to the Corinthians. And yet that letter, 1 Corinthians, he starts, I thank God for you. He starts with that warm greeting. So what is it that the Galatians have done? They must have done something worse. Well, we see Paul cuts to it straight away. They have abandoned the gospel, turned to another gospel, or distorted the gospel. That's what he describes in these first few verses of chapter 1. That, according to Paul, is the worst possible thing. That is what prompts this urgent response. And what Paul goes on to say is that, well, the gospel that he has brought to them has come directly from Jesus. Paul has received it from Jesus, he has passed it on to them, and yet they are turning from that. Paul is saying that the gospel is Jesus plus nothing. And what we go on to see is that in Galatians, what was happening is that they were adding other bits in and distorting, losing sight of Jesus and the complete work of salvation that he has accomplished. Now, I don't know about you, but I imagine that this turning to a different gospel didn't come overnight. And it probably wasn't, I don't think, an intentional rejection of Paul's teaching. I think probably most likely what's happened is that the Galatians have received Christ, but then their heads started to be turned by other teaching that came alongside it that was subtly different, and that the clarity of the gospel in terms of Jesus being at the center of the gospel and Jesus being the gospel was eroded slowly over time. I don't think this is a problem that's limited to the first century. I think this is a problem that affects every century, including the 21st century. That the gospel of Jesus gets distorted. The gospel of Jesus, the clarity of that gets eroded. Many people, and it's very tempting to read the Bible and think, well, surely, God didn't mean that when he said that in the Bible. And we start to be more and more influenced by the culture around us in terms of how we interpret what God's word said and what the gospel is. But this radical gospel that Paul is preaching, that sinful people like you and me who deserve hell are saved by the sacrificial death of Jesus on a cross. And it's that and only that we can have hope in. The clarity of that is often lost, and maybe the gospel is preached and taught in a way that is more palatable, more easy for people to hear. And perhaps one of the ways that it's presented in our culture is that, well, people aren't really that bad. People are generally good, and what we just need Jesus to help us a little bit, help us to get over the bad bits of our lives, help us to accomplish our goals. And the gospel can be presented in a very man-centered way, that Jesus has really come to boost our ego and help us to live the lives we want to lead, rather than recognizing that we are sinful and desperate people before a God who is just and who is loving, but in his loving has sent Christ to us to save us, that we could not and cannot save ourselves. So it's important, a reminder from Galatians, to be wise and be discerning, and to keep Christ and the clarity of our desperate need for him at the center of our gospel, the gospel as we understand it, and not allow our understanding to be clouded by the themes of the world around us. How do we do that? We keep looking to the scriptures, keep seeking to understand it. That's the only way that we can guard ourselves against being led astray by the popular ideas in our culture, and keep on the front foot of following God's word as best we can, and enjoying this wonderful good news that Jesus has come to save sinners like you and me. And we can have confidence before God today because of Jesus, not because of our works, not because we're great people, but because Jesus has died on the cross and risen again, and he has invited us to put our faith in him. God bless you. See you soon.